Welcome back to Outside View Scandals, the channels where history meets high society drama. And today we've got quite the scandalous story to dive into. The abdication of Edward VIII, the king who gave up the throne to marry the love of his life, Wallis Simpson. Now, of course, British society had other things to say about that love story, but we'll get to the juicy details soon enough. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and let's talk about how a king gave up the most powerful position in the British Empire for a twice-divorced American socialite. Oh, and how that went down with the public? Well, let's just say the headlines were delightful. Now, who was Edward VIII before all this drama unfolded? Born Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, yes, that many names, he was the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary. And throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Edward was a bit of a heartthrob, if I'm being honest. He was young, dashing, a fan of modern trends, everything from flashy cars to even jazz. The audacity. But there was a small catch. Edward wasn't exactly what you'd call royal material. You see, while his father, King George V, was every inch the traditional monarch, Edward was, well, let's say a bit too modern. He enjoyed his freedom, wasn't very fond of the endless royal duties, and to put it kindly, had a bit of a reputation as a playboy. He wasn't one to settle down, at least not in the way British society expected of him. But then, in the early 1930s, a certain woman entered his life, Wallis Simpson. And let's be clear, this is where the trouble begins. Not because she was American, although in the 1930s that was certainly scandalous enough, but because she was divorced twice. And in British royal circles, that was like triple sinning. Now let's talk about Wallis Simpson. She was a savvy, ambitious American woman who had worked her way into the highest echelons of British society. Wallis was elegant, charming, and perhaps most importantly, completely unconcerned with the formalities of the British aristocracy. If the royals thought she didn't belong, well, Wallis seemed to find that amusing. She was direct, confident, and more than capable of holding her own among the upper crust of British society. But here's the thing. Wallis was still married when she and Edward became involved. A tiny detail, I know. And Edward wasn't exactly being discreet about the whole affair either. There were endless whispers, gossip, and rumors swirling around Buckingham Palace. But Edward didn't care. He was absolutely infatuated with her. And Wallis? Well, let's just say she didn't mind the attention either. And remember, this is all happening at a time when divorce in British high society was a big deal, something that was still considered morally corrupt. So the idea of the future King of England marrying a divorced woman was nothing short of outrageous. So fast forward to 1936, King George V dies and Edward becomes king. But almost immediately, it's clear that Edward isn't exactly suited for the role. His advisors, the government, and even his own family begin to realize something's off. The new king was more interested in spending time with Wallis than in ruling the British Empire. He would cancel meetings, skip official duties, and throw lavish parties, all while scandalous headlines about his relationship with Wallis were plastered across the tabloids. And to be honest, the British public was kind of split. Many people adored Edward for his charisma and modern sensibilities. But Wallis? Oh, she was another story entirely. To many, she was seen as nothing less than a schemer, a woman determined to become queen. And given the conservative values of the time, she was deemed completely unfit to ever take on such a role. Oh, and let's not forget the British government. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, he made it very clear that a marriage between Edward and Wallis would be problematic, to say the least. And then the inevitable happened. Edward made it known that he intended to marry Wallis once her divorce was finalized. The government, the Church of England, and the royal family panicked. How could the head of the Church of England, a church that explicitly condemned divorce, marry a twice divorced woman? The monarchy, they believed, would be damaged beyond repair. Stanley Baldwin, speaking on behalf of the government, basically told Edward, "It's Wallace or the crown. You can't have both." And Edward's response, "Fine, I'll take Wallace then." It's hard to overstate how shocking this was at the time. A king giving up the throne over love? That's straight out of a romantic novel, but this was real life and it wasn't playing out like a fairy tale. On December 11th in 1936, Edward officially abdicated the throne in a radio broadcast heard around the world. And in a sentence that has since become famous, he said, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." And just like that, he was no longer Edward VIII, King of England, but instead the Duke of Windsor, a title he would hold for the rest of his life. His younger brother, George VI, the father of Queen Elizabeth II, took the throne. And suddenly, Britain had a new king. And Wallis? Well, she was no longer just a scandalous mistress, but now the Duke's wife. They married in 1937 in a quiet ceremony in France, far away from the grandeur of a royal wedding. So what happened after that? Edward and Wallis lived out the rest of their days in relative exile, splitting their time between France and the United States. They remained social figures, always teetering between fascination and controversy. Edward never seemed to regret his decision, but you do wonder if, occasionally, he missed being king. Just a little. Wallis, on the other hand, continued to be viewed with suspicion by the British public for the rest of her life. She was never accepted by the royal family, and the two were mostly estranged from the monarchy after their marriage. But let's be honest, Edward's abdication wasn't just a love story. It revealed the tension between royal tradition and personal desire. Edward was a man ahead of his time in some ways, choosing love over duty, but at the same time, he was someone who simply didn't want the responsibility of being king. He had found an escape in Wallis, and he took it. So, was it a grand romantic gesture or a massive dereliction of duty? And that's up to you to decide. So thanks for joining us today on Outside View Scandals. And if you enjoyed this story of love, betrayal, and royal intrigue, don't forget to like and subscribe for more scandalous tales from history's most notorious figures. And remember, sometimes even a king can't have it all. See you next time. The next video is right here in the end screen.